Coming up on this episode of Crime Family. And so there's something odd going on here with, you'd think you remember somebody coming at you with a sword. Utah is an open carry state, which means that you are literally allowed to have weapons like guns and knives on you out in the open. It's one of those cases where justice has really not been served. And what's frustrating in this case is that we, without a doubt, know who the killer is. There are some suspicious circumstances that kind of look like some sort of cover-up, and the killer has not been put to justice or even charged.
Yeah, to me it just seemed like the police had an agenda or was very hell-bent on doing something.
So, out of 26 witnesses, only one of them is backing up what the police had to say.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Crime Family. I'm your co-host AJ and I'm here with Katie. And today we're back with another episode of the show. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know about our patron community that opened just a little while ago, a few weeks back. So if you like the show and you want exclusive extras like ad-free content, bonus episodes, a private community to connect with us, free merch, and an exclusive new true crime series, Doc Talk, then consider becoming a patron. So Doc Talk, it's like a book club for true crime documentaries. Each month we'll select a new doc to watch and we will discuss it in full. We'll take your questions and discuss the topics that you want. You'll have access to this exclusive new series at the Tier 3 membership level, as well as all the other extras I mentioned. So join us on Patreon to continue the true crime conversation and help us build a community. We'd love to have you. By signing up today, you'll get automatic access to our bonus episodes, including one about Sarah Boone, known as the Suitcase Killer. So it was a really interesting case. So definitely go to our Patreon page and become a member if you want to check that out. So check out the show notes for the link to become a patron today, or go to patreon.com/crimefamilypodcast. Also, we just recently launched our exclusive merch store on Redbubble. So we're super excited to have the official Crime Family logo and designs on everything from t-shirts to stickers to mugs to hats, all this good stuff there. So check out our merch store to help support the show at the link in the show notes. And Katie's going to walk us through, or Katie's going to narrate this episode about a case that she has ready. So what case is it?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie. And today I'm going to be talking about the case of Darrien Hunt. And for whatever reason, this case just really stuck out to me when I stumbled upon it. And I think one of the reasons is because it's one of those cases where justice has really not been served. And what's frustrating in this case is that we, without a doubt, know who the killer is. There are some suspicious circumstances that kind of look like some sort of cover-up, and the killer has not been put to justice or even charged, nor have they even lost their job, as the killer in this case was a Utah County police officer. So like I said, this is the case of Darrien Hunt. He was a 22-year-old black man living in Saratoga Springs, Utah in 2014. According to the MTV show Real Life Crime episode on this case, Darrien lived in Saratoga Springs, Utah, and this city is predominantly white. Darrien and his family, being black, kind of really stood out in this city. So that episode says that there is approximately 93% white people in the city and 0.5% are black. So you can just kind of see how very small the black community is in this city. So Darrien was into cosplay, which is, if you're not familiar with cosplay, is when people dress up as their favorite comic book characters or favorite superheroes or just their favorite characters. It's not something that you just do for conventions like Comic-Con or other comic book conventions. It's something that people actually do on a regular basis with a group of friends if they all have that similar interest. And so Darrien loved sci-fi and anime, and his brother KJ tells a reporter from True Life Crime that they kind of had a wild imagination growing up, and Darrien just loved that kind of sci-fi world. And so on the day that Darrien was murdered, he was cosplaying, and he was dressed up as a character named Mugen from the Samurai Champloo, which is a Japanese anime series. And if you look at pictures of that character and how Darrien was dressed that day, they do look really similar. They both have black afro kind of hair, and the character wears a red shirt and baggy pants, and that's exactly what Darrien had that day. And the character also has a samurai sword that he carries around. And so on this day, Darrien had a sword that he was using for cosplay, but this sword was just a $30 sword that his mom had gotten from the mall, and it wasn't even a real samurai sword, but it was long, and it was in like a sheath that you would carry around a real sword in, so he had that on his back. And so on this day, September 10th, 2014, Darrien is dressed up as Mugen in his red shirt, and he's carrying the sword, and he's walking down the street. But I think a critical thing to note in this case is that Utah is an open carry state, which means that you are literally allowed to have weapons like guns and knives on you out in the open. And so even if he was carrying a real samurai sword, it wouldn't have been illegal because he was of age, so it wouldn't have been illegal for him to be carrying that around. And of course there are some restrictions to that, but according to utahcriminallaw.net, certain people who fall under category 1 or 2, like convicted criminals or those who have substance abuse issues, are not allowed to carry swords or machetes. And obviously if you're a minor, you're not allowed either. And you can't have them in places like schools or high security places like airports. And you also should avoid high traffic places like parks and malls and things like that, just so you're not drawing attention. So anyway, Darrien was not breaking any of these rules, and to point out again, it wasn't even a real sword. Even if it was, it would have been legal. So, while carrying a sword is legal in Utah, it's not necessarily common to see somebody carrying a giant samurai sword around. This is what may have prompted a 911 call on that day on September 10th. When someone who was at the gas station that Darrien was walking by, they saw Darrien walking down the street with his samurai sword, and they called 911. So it's just a concerned citizen, and it does seem reasonable to me that maybe people would be concerned if you see someone kind of walking down the street with a big samurai sword. But there's also some footage of what went down that day, and I'm going to share the link, but I'm just going to show you, AJ, the footage, and just so we can kind of talk about and see what stands out. Just describe a little bit what's happening in this footage. It's kind of choppy, and it just kind of breaks up the footage from different angles, but what you see basically is Darrien walking down the street in his like anime outfit and the sword on his back, and then it kind of cuts to police following him, walking behind him, and then it cuts to him running across the parking lot with the police chasing him. But is there anything that stands out to you in this footage?
I mean, to me, it just looked like pretty normal. He was just walking on the sidewalk there. The police officer looked like he was on a mission right away to like follow him. And then you see him chasing or being chased by the police officer. So it was, it was like a little bit choppy to see. But yeah, to me, it just seemed like the police had an agenda or was very hell-bent on doing something, I feel, just based on the way he's like marching, like really, like it looks like he's marching really, towards him with like the purpose of wanting to, not necessarily, I don't know if he wanted to harm him or whatever, but he just seemed very concerned right from the jump, which kind of stood out to me. But what stood out to me as well is that Darrien is just very nonchalantly walking down the sidewalk. He's kind of at this gas station, like strip mall kind of place, but he is just very calmly walking down the street. And then you can kind of see the police are more on edge, which I guess would be expected because they're kind of suspecting maybe something's going on. But
Darrien's not acting sketchy. It doesn't look like he's like on drugs or drunk or anything. He's very much just like walking down the street. And if he didn't have a sword, that fake samurai sword on his back, like he would look just like a regular person walking down the street. And something else that stood out to me is that very early in the footage, there's like a woman that comes out of one of the stores and she's right behind him walking behind Darrien. And so if she was scared, you wouldn't think that she'd be like at arm's length away from Darrien, who has his sword. So she doesn't seem to be scared or have any issue with him at all, which I think is very telling to kind of his presence there. It wasn't disturbing to this woman walking down the street as well. And so after that 911 call, the police do show up, obviously, as we saw in that footage. But what's frustrating is that we really don't know what happened fully, or we don't have the full picture of what really went down that day. And it feels like we should have more detail. So the officers that do show up are Officer Scheuerhammer and Officer Judson. And they claim that Scheuerhammer had a brief conversation with Darrien after stopping him. He asks him, what's going on, and Darrien just says that he's kind of looking for a ride. Scheuerhammer says that he asks Darrien to put his sword on top of his car and hand over the sword so that they can just kind of talk without having kind of that sword there. And he says that Darrien was very eerily calm, and he says he seemed kind of detached from the situation. And he says that Darrien responded just by saying that no, he can't do that because it's his sword. And Officer Scheuerhammer says that Darrien wasn't aggressive or argumentative in any way. And also what we do know is that all of this, from the 911 call to what happens next, only happens within about a 9-minute time frame. So Darrien walking down the street, the 911 call, and then the police chasing Darrien, it all happens very quickly. And there's a woman who talks to the reporter from that MTV episode, and she says that she notices that the police were kind of creeping around the parking lot behind Darrien, and that he kind of got cornered by police by the end of it. But she says that they were definitely just talking to him calmly, they were questioning him, but she wasn't close enough to hear exactly what they were saying. But she says that she was close enough that she would have been able to hear if there was like yelling or an argument going on. And so that didn't happen. It seemed that they were all just very calmly standing there talking. Another witness does say that they saw Darrien holding out the sword horizontally as if he was, trying to pass the sword over to them, to the police. The police officers themselves even have a different story to what happened that day. Scheuerhammer says that Darrien lunged at the other Officer Judson with the sword, but Officer Judson says that Darrien actually lunged at Scheuerhammer. And so there's something odd going on here with, you'd think you remember somebody coming at you with a sword, and you'd think you remember if it was they were coming after somebody else instead of you. So for whatever reason, these officers can't get their story straight. There was approximately 26 eyewitnesses that didn't see the whole thing, but they saw kind of bits and pieces of what happened that day. And apparently only 2 of them actually said that they saw Darrien swing the sword. But then later, one of those witnesses says that they never actually said that. They never saw Darrien swing the sword. So that was not correct. And the one person that did stick to the story, saying that Darrien did swing at the officers, they were actually a very close family member of another officer in a nearby city who had been killed just the day before. And so maybe there was some bias, high emotion going on, so that they were kind of on the side of the police and were backing up what they were saying. So, out of 26 witnesses, only one of them is backing up what the police had to say. Another one of those witnesses claims that Darrien did pull out the sword, but it was kind of just pulling it out of the sheath to show the officers that it wasn't real and that it wasn't, it wasn't dangerous at all. And so it kind of looked like he was showing them and that he was going to surrender the sword like they asked. And that Darrien asks, "Why are you harassing me?" And that's when he kind of started to walk away from them, because there really was no point to the police trying to interrogate him when he really was doing nothing wrong. And it was at this point when there were shots fired. So the first witness that I had mentioned before, she was in her car kind of watching this whole thing go down. And she says that she looked down for a second to kind of shift her gear shift on her car so she could back up or drive out of this parking lot. And it was when her head was down is when she heard the gun's shots. So she didn't actually see if he had lunged or if he didn't lunge. All she heard was the gunshots. And by the time she looked up, that's when they start running. And she just kind of gets out of the parking lot as fast as she can. And so we know that after these first gunshots, Darrien starts running, as we see in that footage. And some reports say that at least one of the shots at this point has already hit Darrien. And yeah, so it makes sense that he's already shot and he's like, I gotta get out of here. And that's when he starts running. But we don't know exactly when the shots that were fired actually did hit him. And as we know, Darrien is running across the parking lot and the police are full speed chasing after him, and they're shooting this entire time. And they ultimately kill him because of this incident. And so, like I was saying before, one of the very frustrating things about this is that there are security cameras, obviously, because we see some of the footage, but there's some angled that would potentially kind of show the whole thing go down in one straight motion. And there's a picture that was taken of Darrien that day, and he's kind of standing there with the police very nonchalantly. And in that picture, there's a security camera right above them. But then literally the next day, when people go back, that security camera has been removed. Like, it's just gone, as if it had never been there. And for whatever reason, none of the police officers had their body cameras on. I think Hammer didn't even have his body camera on him. The other officer did have it on, but he didn't turn it on. And the dash cam from their police vehicles wasn't turned on either. And so when they were questioned about this, they were basically just like, yeah, they worked. We had them, but we just didn't turn them on. And so that's frustrating because it's like, shouldn't that just be a requirement to have them on at all times so you can like actually see what's going on? So that frustrates me to no end.
Yeah, well, it's annoying. They shouldn't be able to turn them off. Like, they should just be automatically on permanently.
Yeah, they should be. And the dash cam should be on at all times. Like, what's the value in turning them off? Like, there's no reason they should be off, because you never know, driving down the road when you stop, like, you never know what they're going to capture that could be helpful. And so it kind of seems like they turned them off for a reason, which, is super sketchy. And you think, and like doing some reading, it doesn't even look like it's a law or that they would get punished for turning them off. It's just kind of like, they're there. You should probably use them. If you don't, then, that's just how it went. So that's frustrating. So Darrien's family actually had to find out via social media that it was the police officers that had shot and killed Darrien. They weren't even told that when they initially were told what had happened. I guess they just were told that Darrien was shot and killed, but nobody said that it was from a police officer. So they had to find that out via a social media post from somebody else, which I think is horrifying. And when they found out that Darrien had allegedly lunged at police, they said that was absolutely something that he would never have done. And further to this, Darrien's family's lawyer says that the fact that Darrien was running from the police, it kind of made their use of deadly force really unnecessary and, almost unlawful, because their lives weren't at danger at this point when he's running away from them. His back is turned, so why are they chasing him and then opening fire on him? So it feels like they, weren't scared for their lives at this point. But I guess the police defend themselves and saying, well, they thought that maybe he could have taken out the sword and slashed any innocent person that he came across if, he was kind of desperate. Which it's kind of like stretching for a reason to why they shot him. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the police say that, Darrien lunged at one of them, even though they can't figure out which one he lunged at, which seems kind of weird. The autopsy reveals that he was actually shot 6 times in the back. Not necessarily like in the back of like his actual back, but like the back of his body. And so people are saying, how do you get shot in the back if you're lunging at somebody? So it was very obvious that his back was turned and he was, just either turned or running at the time when they shot him. So their stories just aren't adding up. There's some reports that say he was shot in the legs, he was shot in the wrist, and ultimately the shot that killed him was to his back. And so that deadly shot was in his back, and that bullet never exited his body. So that's what ultimately killed him. And so, like I was saying before, how do you get shot in the back if you're lunging at somebody and then they shoot you because they're scared for their lives? I guess if the police were surrounding him, he could have lunged at one of them and the other one shot him in the back. But from the pictures and from the descriptions of what happened that day, both of the police officers were kind of in front of him talking to him. So there wasn't like one behind him that would have shot him if he lunged at the other. So that doesn't add up either. Darrien's mother also claims that before this incident, Darrien had an incident with Officer Scheuerhammer during a traffic stop where he had a very minor violation. It was something like his like blinker was out or his light was dead or something on his car in the middle of the day. And Scheuerhammer wanted to like impound his car, which is like very extreme for the offense that he had, very minor. And his mom accused Scheuerhammer of being a racist because Scheuerhammer is white, so was the other officer that showed up that day, and of course Darrien is black. And so maybe when Scheuerhammer showed up, recognized Darrien, maybe kind of had this in the back of his head. It was on his mind as he was chasing him, like he already had an incident with this guy. So kind of a lot of variables happening. Maybe he is a racist or, had racist thoughts. We don't know. Of course, he'll never admit that. And that's just speculation on my part, but his family does kind of think that maybe that has something to do with it. Yeah, so any thoughts so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's very frustrating to hear. This was 2014, right? You said?
Yes.
Yeah. It's just so frustrating to hear. It's kind of a scenario that we hear time and time again. And I think the point that some people were making or that you mentioned was that, yeah, the fact that he had shots in his back shows that his back was to the officers, probably running away from them. So you can't really make the argument that the police officers' lives were in danger. I feel like just that in and of itself is evidence that their force was unnecessary, that it was malicious, or that it wasn't necessary, because obviously if you're shooting him in the back, he's not facing you because he's probably running away. And from what we saw a little bit in that surveillance footage, looked like that's what was happening. It just seems like it's so obvious that the police were very much in the wrong and that they used excessive force for absolutely no reason. And I have no doubt that the officers probably were racist, even if they, implicit bias or, it was on a subconscious level, because obviously they'll never admit that they had that thought. But I would suspect that if the person holding this toy sword were white, that it would have had a very different result. And so those are the thoughts that are running through my mind. And it's just crazy to think that the police would even have a logical explanation for any of this when it seems so obvious just based on the physical evidence and like the autopsy and the shots on his body that, it's not going to be in line with any sort of defense that they're going to come up with that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they can't even get their story straight of who he lunged at, kind of makes it like they both are making up a story and they couldn't even get that story straight. So you'd think you would remember being lunged at with a sword.
Yeah, and the cops, I mean, obviously they're so dumb they can't even get their own story straight. So I just think it's a lot of covering their own backs and trying to come up with something that will allow them to kind of get off a little bit scot-free. So I don't really buy anything that they're saying. And I tend to believe that it was all very unnecessary.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the fact that 911 call came in, so they kind of knew what they were dealing with. They thought maybe there was somebody with an actual sword walking down the street. So you'd think like, oh, let's get our body cameras on, our dash cams on, so we can record. So in case something really does go down, we have evidence of what happened. But the fact that they didn't even think about that, or maybe it's just, common practice for them not to turn their cameras on, so they could say whatever they want happened and then get rid of security cameras that actually did capture the whole thing. So it just kind of seemed like something is happening, something is being covered up, and we'll just kind of never understand what happened. Also, another thing that is sad is when you watch that episode on MTV, Darrien's mother, she talks about, so Darrien's mother is white and his father was black, but she talks about how this kind of shows just kind of how privileged we are as white people. She said she never had the talk with them, or she felt like she didn't need to have the talk with them. And the talk is, I guess, very a common thing that black families have about how to talk to police. If you ever get pulled over, if you ever come in contact with the police, like how to act, what to say, what not to say. so that you don't get into an incident like this. And like, I never would have thought that that was a thing that you would have to talk to your kids about, but it's very common in the Black community. And so his mother was saying she thought that in this day and age, the way, racism isn't what it used to be, that she didn't feel like she needed to have that talk with her kids. And so she kind of blames herself that maybe if she had talked to her kids about that maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I mean, of course, it's not her fault. And regardless of, what Darrien would have said or did, I think that this was unnecessary, the way the whole thing went down.
Yeah, the point that you mentioned about the fact that, we are privileged, as white people, because when you hear the talk, like, that's not what you think of. So the fact that, yeah, there are Black families who have to have, the talk with their kids, which would mean how to interact with police. So it's like a sad reality that even this day and age, that is something that they have to be told, and, how it's so different for that community. So it's crazy to think that. And also, I think what you were saying too about, obviously it's not his mother's fault, and maybe she thought like, well, racism isn't what it used to be. And I think there was like a period, and also this could be, a sign of like my own privilege too, thinking this, but I feel like there was a period in time when, I'm trying not to get like too political or too in depth, but I think there was a time during like when Barack Obama was president that people thought like, look, there's a Black man who's president, so like therefore racism doesn't exist. Things are way better now. Like, look, we have a Black president. And I think, in many ways it's like, yes, there is a Black president, which is great, but there were so many people who were not happy that he was president, and there were so many people who were racist, and maybe it was suppressed because it wasn't as, for that period of time, that maybe it wasn't going to be quote unquote acceptable. But now we see, like, today's day and age, like when what's his name, Donald Trump, and all of the racists that exist now, it's like it became kind of more acceptable to be a disgusting racist. So that's why you're seeing all these people coming out of the woodwork now, whereas I feel like maybe back in 2014 they were still sort of in that time where you're like thinking that because there's a Black president that racism isn't as big of a thing as it once was, when really obviously it is. So I think, and this was obviously before like the George Floyd incident and the Trayvon Martin incident. I think this was before that. So like it was also an earlier time too, before all of that, where that's not really at the top of your mind too.
Yeah. And I think maybe because it was Barack Obama as president, like you were saying, those racists were out and vocal about it because of who the president was. Even though, of course, they still exist, but they were like kind of suppressing it. And then when they have their chance to kind of show their racist side, they go for it, which may have been the case in this situation, sadly. Of course, we don't know that. That's just speculation. But I mean, it is very sad.
Yeah, like when, a couple of years ago, like when the president's saying all these horrible racist things and is a disgusting person, then, it almost empowers everyone else who's racist and disgusting to be like, well, the president gets away with it and it's fine. So like nothing will happen to us because we can just, you know what I mean? Like the president's doing it, so we can do it. It was just like, yeah, crazy to think.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like I said at the beginning, there really isn't any justice in this case because the officers were never charged with any wrongdoing. The fact that they shot and killed him was prosecutors found that to be acceptable force that they used because they felt that their lives were in danger. So, that kind of went unpunished as well. Darrien's mother sued the city and the officers. And this is something that I have never heard before. So she was offered a $900,000 settlement that came along with a gag order. So if she accepted that, she wouldn't have been allowed to talk about this case or, kind of rally any kind of support for getting justice. So she turned this down because, obviously she did not want that gag order. But in 2016, a federal judge actually ordered her to take the money and therefore forced that gag order on her, which she had no choice but to accept because it was a court order. Have you ever heard of that before? Like forcing someone to take this money and a gag order that goes along with it?
You can do that? I didn't know that was actually a thing that could happen.
I know.
I thought, if you're offered it, you have the choice whether to accept it or not. That's so bizarre.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I've never heard of that either. Wow.
And she did turn it down. And then eventually it was just like, well, no, you're taking it. You're taking the money.
That's crazy. Wow, that's wild. I did not even think that. How is that even legal? You can't just force somebody. And like also $900,000. It's like, yes, who wouldn't want $900,000? But that's also that's nothing in the grand scheme of things when your child dies and you're not allowed to talk about the case forever. And for $900,000, like what is that? So it's just wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. And so, like I said, she originally turned it down because, you know, just that having that gag order attached to that wasn't enough. It kind of felt like hush money, right? Here's your money. Don't ever talk about this again. And that's kind of what she's forced to do, which is super unfortunate. While she can't kind of, I guess, rally for justice for her son, there is a change.org petition online that's asking to have Darrien's case reopened. And so I guess there are people out there that are kind of speaking up on her behalf. And this petition currently has close to 900,000 signatures. So there is a lot of support out there. There's a lot of people that kind of see the misjustice in this, how there was no justice, and standing up for Darrien. And of course, seeing that this was a tragedy that should never have happened. So yeah, just like a lot of things to think about and crazy. I feel like there's some sort of cover up, especially that gag order that is being forced. It's like she can't dig into the case anymore. And how the police can't get their story straight, how there's probably video footage out there that's never been released, never been talked about. So definitely a sketchy situation and super sad.
Wow, yeah, that's wild. You should share the link to the petition. We can put that in the show notes because I think I want to sign that petition for sure, and I think other people will too because that's wild.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be signing it and I'll link it.
Yeah, it's like I still can't get over the fact that she was forced to take this gag order and that money. Like that to me is just bizarre. But it's just so you're telling me nothing ever happened to the police at all? Like they're just out there roaming free. Who knows what else they're doing? Like they're probably like, you know, they got away with murder basically, or in my opinion, allegedly.
Yeah, as far as I know, there was never any charges.
That's really annoying. Really annoying. And you think like maybe now
it's crazy. I was gonna say back to the gag order, like it's crazy how she's like forced to take that money. It's like what, they just deposit it into her bank against her will, and then now that she has the money she can't talk. It's like so forceful. I can't imagine how she feels.
Yeah, it's like you should be able to say, well, I didn't agree to have that money put in my account, so you can put it in there if you want, but that doesn't bind me to anything. Like you put it in there if you want, but that doesn't, you know, like it's just crazy to me that that's even legal. That, I mean, you know, they can put the money in there if they want. That's like their prerogative, like please do. But it's just weird that that's like binding her also by this like sort of NDA, or like she can't talk about it when that's not even something she could agree to. I feel like you have to sign sort of like if it's an NDA, that's something you have to sign for consent to. You can't just like, that's just crazy to me. And obviously I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the ins and outs of these kind of things, but to me that seems like something that's highly illegal, or should be highly illegal.
Yeah, probably because it was a court order. They made her sign it, or she doesn't need to sign it because it was ordered by the court. Either way, it just seems like a kind of an unbelievable thing that I've never heard of happening before. Didn't know that was a thing. You could force somebody to take a settlement that they don't want. So yeah, ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think that maybe one, not really a positive thing, but I think something that good that can come out of it is, you know, we're kind of in this era of, you know, social reckoning for, you know, police brutality. And I think, you know, with the George Floyd murder and the Breonna Taylor murder as well, like it's a lot more in the public consciousness. So I think maybe the petition will be able to gain a lot more traction and attention, and then hopefully some action can come out of that, because now we're kind of in this mode where these kind of cases might get a lot more press than maybe they would have even, you know, back when it happened in 2014 or even, you know, 5 years ago. So I think if anything, we might be at a period of time now where hopefully this kind of case can get the attention it deserves, and then with the petition and everything, that we can finally see some sort of resolution and justice.
Yeah, I hope everyone does sign the petition and at least, you know, thinks a little bit more about this case, and whether the petition will reopen the case, whether it will give justice. I think Even just kind of putting those police officers under the microscope a little bit more, maybe making it mandatory to have your body cam and dash cams on at all times, regardless of, what you're doing. Like, oh, you're on a break at the gas station, like put on your dash cams. I feel like that should just be punishable if you don't. Like, that just seems like a very simple thing that they could do.
And it's probably too, part of it is like all the police officers at the top are also guilty of doing that. So they're not going to come down on other police officers for doing that, because then they would have to address their own misconduct by doing it themselves, I'm sure. I mean, obviously, this is just my opinion. I don't know for sure, but I'm saying like it's probably a lot of other people covering for other people because they also don't want to get caught. But I just think the fact that they're able to shut them off, like those things should not be even have like an external shut off button that the police officer can even do. Because even if you take the other stuff out, like even if it's just for their own protection, like, you never know when something might come up that would prove your case. So why wouldn't you want to have that on when those instances happen?
Yeah. What's the benefit of turning it off? Like, I mean, that's just like having a security camera outside your house, but I'm going to turn it off at certain times. Like, why? You just never know what's going to happen and when. So why not just always have to have them on? That makes most sense to me.
Yeah, and it's just like by shutting it off and having the officer shut it off, that just creates suspicion. Yeah,
it's like you're very selective of what you're going to record and when and who you're going to record, and, like specific calls that you're going to record. Like it shouldn't be an option. It should be mandatory. Because, yeah, it does create suspicion.
Yeah, you create that doubt. Like, the minute that thing goes off and then maybe it'll come back on again hours later. And then it's always going to create, even if nothing happened in that 3 hours and it's so mundane, you're obviously going to jump to, well, what happened in 3 hours? Why was it shut off? So if anything, even if you're totally innocent, it's going to create that doubt. So why wouldn't you want to just have that on just to like prove, just to show, even if you have nothing to hide? But obviously all these cops have something major to hide, I'm sure, especially maybe in this case. And that's why they're shut off. But the fact that they're even allowed to shut them off is crazy to me.
Maybe you could kind of get over if, one of them forgot to turn on their body cam, but there was two officers, didn't have a body cam on, their dash cams weren't on. Like, that's just like multiple layers of either deliberately not wanting to record what was happening or just like not caring enough to be like, let's make sure these are on. Either way, it's not a good look. And I feel like something should be done or said or, just acknowledged that this, they fucked up, which hasn't happened.
And I feel like there's so many cases where similar things like this happen and there's alleged police misconduct. It's always times when body cams are not on. And it's like, that's why you automatically assume that anytime they get shut off by the officer, that there's a reason why it's shut off, that there's something they're hiding. Because it seems like every single time that one of these things goes down, it's always inconveniently in this time frame when it was shut off. It just seems like so, like, it's not rocket science to think if somebody shuts off their body cam footage, there's obviously something. But then also too, being in the court of law, like, you can't, that isn't reason enough to put, like, to convict someone off video that you don't have. So even if there is that doubt, I'm sure the police officer doesn't care, because he doesn't care if there's doubt, but there's nothing to prove that he did it either,
Yeah, exactly. But if there was some sort of punishment or, some sort of repercussions to not having a fully functional dash cam and body cam on, then, what's going to stop them from just never using it? Because, they can just do whatever the fuck they want and no one's going to see it, which I feel like is what sort of happened in this case. Like, they definitely did things they weren't supposed to, didn't want people to know about it. And that's what happened. And we'll never know.
Yeah, I feel like there should be a requirement, like, if a cop works a 12-hour shift, at the end of the shift, before they're allowed to go home, they should have to turn in their dash cam and their body cam, and there should be 12 hours of footage on that. And if there's 12 hours of footage, then they can go home. Yeah. Like, that should be just like what they do.
Yeah. Yeah, can you imagine that they just never turned their body cam on? Like, who knows what they did for the, 12-hour shift? They could have been out doing whatever the fuck they wanted. No one would see it. And then they just go home. They could have been doing a lot of sketchy stuff in that time. So, yeah.
Yeah. There's no accountability. But that kind of goes back to what I said before. Like, it's probably because the people at the top are also doing sketchy shit. So they have no incentive to actually call out the other people, because it's going to bring up their own sketchy shit. So it's just like systemic at this point, and it just needs like a whole overhaul.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
We'll definitely put the link to the petition in the show notes. So definitely go and sign that petition, because it's for a really important cause, and hopefully, this case gets some traction, or this petition, like you said, it already has 900,000 signatures, which is great. But if you're listening to this and you're as frustrated as we are about this case, then definitely sign that petition.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's all we have today for the Darrien Hunt case. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week for a brand new case. And like we said at the beginning, make sure you join our Patreon if you can't get enough of our content. There's lots of good stuff in there and lots of good stuff coming up. Check out our merch, check out our website, crimefamilypodcast.ca. And definitely check out our Patreon at patreon.com/crimefamilypodcast. See you next time.
Bye.